Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Howell, and I'm from the Wolf Conservation Center. And I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's webinar, Ecology and Conservation of Mountain Lions in Greater Los Angeles. Today, we're excited to throw our topic to the cats, specifically the mountain lions living in Los Angeles and adjacent areas. Naturally, vast expanses of concrete teeming with people and cars shouldn't be the ideal environment for large elusive predators. Still, a city with the dubious honor of being among the most traffic-afflicted regions in the United States also has mountain lions living within the city limits. Despite their ability to do a great job at avoiding people, mountain lions living in the greater Los Angeles area have gotten a lot of attention over the years, thanks in part to an individual lion people call P22. P22 has become something of a celebrity since he was first spotted 10 years ago in Griffith Park, a 4,000-acre park tucked into the Hollywood Hills. But fame only gets you so far. And with the many obstacles mountain lions in and adjacent to Los Angeles face, including high rates of inbreeding, low genetic diversity, isolated home ranges, vehicle collisions, and more, these cats are at risk of local extinction. So with us tonight is Dr. John Benson, who will discuss the ecology and conservation of mountain lions in Greater LA and explain why there's hope for the cats despite the daunting challenges they face. Dr. Benson and his colleagues with the National Park Service have been studying behavior and population dynamics of mountain lions in Southern California for almost 20 years to investigate their ecology in and adjacent to Los Angeles. And their research has revealed that these populations can persist with relatively modest efforts. Dr. John Benson is an associate professor of vertebrate ecology at the University of Nebraska. He's conducted research on wildlife populations across North America, studying mountain lions, wolves, black bears, coyotes, moose, mule deer, bighorn sheep, elk, white sharks, and other species. He's motivated by the desire to inform the conservation of wildlife and by a fascination with the natural world. His work combines population, behavioral, molecular, and landscape ecology as he attempts to understand factors influencing individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. In his lab at the University of Nebraska, they conduct intensive field studies around the world, asking questions grounded in theoretical ecology and using quantitative approaches to inform conservation and contribute to basic ecology. Before we get started tonight, just a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. You'll find them in the control panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of tonight's presentation. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available within a day or two on the Wolf Conservation Center website. So I think that's it. So I'll turn the time over to you, John. It's great seeing you.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Maggie. Great to be here with you and with everyone else. Thanks for that nice introduction. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about ecology and conservation of mountain lions in Greater LA. And yeah, I'm coming to you live from Lincoln, Nebraska today. And I just wanted to quickly introduce my two main co-authors, and I'll introduce a few more along the way. But yeah, I've been doing this work with Jeff Sikich and Seth Riley of the National Park Service. So Seth has led research on mountain lions and actually a number of other wildlife species in the Santa Monica Mountains for about the last 20 years. And Jeff has led the field component for the mountain lion research during that same time period. They've been great to work with, and I was actually sort of hanging out with them in California earlier this week. So yeah, excited to tell you a bit about what we've learned here. So I thought I'd start by just talking a bit broadly about mountain lions. And a lot of you may know some of this information or all of it, but I thought it's worth going over. And so mountain lions, of course, are a cat of many names. And so in different parts of the United States and across their range, they have many different names. But just within the US, they're sometimes known as pumas, cougars, panthers. So the Florida panthers, those are mountain lions, or catamounts in the Northeast, where perhaps many of you are. I'm from New England, which is where they were called catamounts. Unfortunately, as you all know, we don't actually have mountain lions in the Northeastern United States currently, at least not viable populations. But this is the largest wild felid in the United States, except for, the occasional jaguar that might wander in from Mexico into New Mexico or Arizona. And these are big cats. And so, for males, maybe on average about 140 pounds or even bigger. Females maybe close to 100 pounds or even bigger. And as they are large predators, they require large prey. And typically across the US at least, where you find mountain lions, you're going to find them preying primarily on deer, either mule deer, black-tailed deer, or white-tailed deer. But they also kill other large ungulates, things like elk or bighorn sheep. But they also do eat smaller prey on occasion, things like raccoons and coyotes, including in the LA system that we work in. And one of the real notable things about mountain lions, and of course most large carnivores, is that they use large spaces and they tend to require large home ranges. And so for males, there's a ton of variation across their geographical distribution. But on average, we think that they tend to use about 400 square kilometers for an adult male, whereas females are a bit smaller, but still a big area at about 140 square kilometers. And again, quite a bit of variation there. And these large spaces relate directly to their polygynous mating system. So you've got a situation where one adult male is going to be breeding with multiple adult females. Typically, one adult male might be breeding with 2 or 3 females. And so that large home range encompasses the smaller home range of, say, 2 to 3 females. Another notable characteristic is that males do kill other mountain lions. Often this is other males, sort of territorial disputes over mating access, but also over potentially other things like access to kills, deer kills, that sort of thing. And males will occasionally kill females as well. Okay, so let's dive into the greater Los Angeles area where we did the work. So this is the second largest metropolitan area in the US, of course, second to New York City, and it's home to over 18 million people. And interestingly enough, also mountain lions. And so as Maggie was alluding to, it presents this really interesting situation of, this really large cat, this top predator, moving through just sort of an endless stream of humanity in the greater LA area. And that's really been the focus of our research in greater LA. And so here's a look at where we've done that work. A lot of the work is focused in the Santa Monica Mountains, which is shown with this blue polygon at the bottom here. This is a small isolated population of about 15 mountain lions at any given time, so really small. And they're surrounded by anthropogenic barriers. So this map doesn't show it all that well, but this is the 101 freeway. Over here is the 405 freeway to the east. To the west, you have a bunch of agriculture and development, and then of course the Pacific Ocean to the south. So they're really, there's limited movement of mountain lions across these freeways such that the Santa Monicas are a pretty isolated population. But we're also tracking mountain lions in other areas north of the freeway, so in the Santa Susana Mountains, the Simi Hills, and some of these interesting little sort of habitat islands surrounded by densely populated neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and also suburbs like Glendale and Burbank. So one of the initial questions when Seth and Jeff started this research is just sort of, how do these animals navigate this human-dominated landscape? And so we can think of conserving large carnivores in these human-dominated landscapes like Southern California as probably the ultimate, or certainly one of the ultimate challenges for conservation. And again, a lot of this comes back to the need for large spaces and the tendency for these animals to roam widely, at least in settings that are more natural than Southern California. And so one of the just basic questions that we'll kind of start with and maybe set the stage with a bit is, how do mountain lions move and behave in Los Angeles? And specifically, we'll take a look at their space use with respect to home ranges and how that's potentially altered by human disturbance and humans in general. And then also resource use and selection. So looking at the use and selection or avoidance of different natural or anthropogenic landscape features. And one of the really cool things or interesting things about this study area that we work in Southern California is that we can look at these behaviors relative to a really steep gradient in development, where we're tracking mountain lions in relatively remote areas, at least as remote as it gets in Southern California, where they don't encounter humans all that frequently, but we're also tracking animals within the city limits of Los Angeles, like P22, who Maggie mentioned, in Griffith Park within LA. And so looking at how their behavior varies across that gradient is one of the big things that we've been able to do over the years. And I just wanted to start, an obvious question is kind of, what do they eat? And it turns out that mountain lions in LA eat pretty much what mountain lions eat everywhere else across the United States where they exist. and that's deer. In this case, it's mule deer across the greater LA area. And so all these red dots represent locations on the landscape where we documented a radio-collared mountain lion killing and consuming a mule deer. And I won't get into the analysis we did here. This comes from a paper from 2016. But the point here is just that we do think that their primary prey, maybe high 80% to over 90% for these individual mountain lions tends to be deer, but they do occasionally kill smaller prey as well. And so first I want to take a look at home range size and how that varies across varying degrees of development. And so this plot here shows a lot of our data. I've withheld a couple of animals, and I'll tell you why in a second. But on the y-axis, we've got home range size in kilometers square. And again, you can see those large areas being used by mountain lions. And then on the x-axis, we've got the proportion of development within each home range. And we can look at the relationship. And essentially what we see for most of the animals is a linear relationship, where the more development you have in a given area, the larger the home range for the mountain lion will be. And why is that? Well, probably it's because, we certainly think the development isn't very useful in terms of mountain lion habitat. So anytime you're sort of losing some of the space to development, the mountain lion potentially is making that up in terms of increasing the total area used. Additionally, with fragmentation, potentially you have some animals moving between fragmented patches, which again expands the overall area that's used. One thing to note here, though, is you can see this are relatively low to moderate levels of development. So within the home ranges, we're looking at 0% to about 7%, at least in this plot, in terms of the amount of development. So we see this linear increase at low and moderate levels of development. Now, here's another figure. It comes from the same paper led by Seth that we published in Journal of Wildlife Management last year. And it shows some of the same relationships, but a bit more. And so here, the animals are separated as subadults. Okay, so these would be independent age mountain lions that are independent from their mother, but haven't started breeding themselves yet. And then adults, which are the breeding animals. And you can see that same linear relationship, larger home ranges as you get into areas of more development for the subadults. Similar trend for most of the adults, linear relationship with an increase in home range size with higher levels of development. But then we've got these two obvious outliers. And it turns out that that's P22 and another animal that lives in a highly urbanized environment, P41, I should say lived. But these animals were really the outliers and were doing things a bit differently. So we see this steady increase as development increases, and then we see this sort of precipitous drop off. And these are two of the smallest mountain lion home ranges ever documented. And so again, just to sort of provide some context for where and how they're living, P22 is in Griffith Park, surrounded by big freeways and densely populated neighborhoods. P41 in the Verdugo Mountains, similar situation. And so again, what we see is this increase in home range size as you get into areas of more development, until you get into such extreme development, like right in the city of LA and Burbank and Glendale, that actually the freeways and the development starts to become an actual barrier to mountain lion movement. So here's kind of a look at all the data. And so I thought it would be helpful to, again, look at the mean home range across the range of the species for mountain lions relative to what we see in LA. And maybe a bit surprising is that we see it's, for most animals, it's pretty similar to what we see across their range. So adult males come in right about where we'd expect, just under 400 square kilometers for their home ranges. Adult females, just under the sort of population level mean of 140, or I should say range-wide mean. So mountain lions in general in LA area are doing things pretty similarly, but then we have P22 and P41. Again, P22's home range at 24 square kilometers, and these are both adult males, making it even more surprising how little space they actually use. This we think we're pretty confident is the smallest home range ever documented for an adult male of the species. So let's take a quick look at why that is. And it really comes down to what we think are some pretty significant anthropogenic barriers. So here's a different mountain lion, P1. This is in the Santa Monica Mountains. Pretty interesting because he's basically using the entire mountain range bordered by those freeways that I pointed out before, but he's using essentially what we'd expect, 400 square kilometers. Then we bounce over to Griffith Park inside the city of Los Angeles, and we see this teeny home range surrounded by, a bunch of development neighborhoods and big freeways at 24 square kilometers. Okay, so this is P22. Maggie already introduced him. sometimes known as the Hollywood lion, this awesome picture, which you've probably seen, taken from a trail camera setup with the help of National Geographic with the Hollywood sign in the back. Let's take a look. Let's zoom in on where he's living. So this is Griffith Park, and there's his home range shown in red. And importantly, it's surrounded by some of the busiest freeways in California. You've got the 101, the 134, and then Interstate 5 surrounding him on 3 sides. And then you've got the city of Los Angeles directly south. And so you can see he's never crossed these freeways since we started tracking him. And actually, he was collared by Jeff first, I believe, in 2012. And so it's been 10 years. He's been roaming Griffith Park using this home range of about 24 square kilometers. And he's never crossed any of these freeways. And he only rarely gets outside of Griffith Park and outside of these mountains into the neighborhoods. And I'll show you a bit more about that in a bit. Importantly, there are no other mountain lions in Griffith Park. And so that's a real bummer for P22. Obviously, typically one of the reasons males use such large areas is to overlap with multiple females, but there are no females in Griffith Park. So he almost certainly has never bred, and we're quite confident there are not any females in Griffith Park. We have documented females in the Verdugo Mountains just to the northeast, but he's never wandered over there. He's never crossed those freeways to try to get there. And that really just kind of highlights the significant nature of these anthropogenic barriers, how much of a barrier these freeways really are, because the motivation is clearly there to go find females, and yet he sticks it out there in Griffith Park. So I thought I'd show this, as long as we're kind of going all in on P22 here. This is sort of an animated graphic, a video that my PhD student Kyle Doherty put together. And it shows some of his telemetry data, sequential telemetry locations from 2018, actually, and just shows the way he moves around Griffith Park. And really, to me, it was kind of just a cool way to visualize the landscape that these animals are up against. You can see the rugged mountains within Griffith Park, and I'm sure a lot of you have been in there yourselves. But then just, take a look at the landscape surrounding him. Here's these huge freeways that he never crosses. Here's all these neighborhoods in LA. And it just really gives you a sense of the isolation and the barriers that he's up against in terms of sticking to this very small home range. Okay, yeah, so moving on to resource selection. And again, so this is a results from a resource selection model. And basically that's just a model that we use to we take the telemetry data and we're trying to understand how they select or avoid different landscape features within their home ranges. Now, this is a pretty intense plot, pretty busy, a lot going on, but we'll get through it together. In fact, let's simplify it. And so I just want to block out some of it and point out that this is really important here on the y-axis. We've got this red line at 0. And so the thing to keep in mind is all these are coefficients that come out of the model. So these are results from the model that indicate the responses, in this case, of different age and sex classes of mountain lions. So you can see we have adult females, adult males, subadult females, and subadult males color-coded. These coefficients show their selection or avoidance of specific landscape features. So let's start with the natural vegetation classes. And if the coefficients are above the red line, above 0, that means they're avoiding these features. If they're below, that means they're selecting these features. I should also point out that this selection and avoidance is in a distance-based context. And what that means is if they're selecting a feature, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually in that habitat feature. What it means is they're closer than you'd expect by chance alone. So it works on how close or far they are from given landscape features to see if they're sort of attracted or avoiding those features. And starting with the natural vegetation, here's coastal sage scrub. So this is a thick, scrubby habitat found in Mediterranean environments in coastal California. You can see all age and sex classes are basically selecting coastal sage, also selecting riparian woodlands. This isn't a big surprise. So these tend to be pretty thick woodlands along riparian areas, very dry landscape in Southern California. And so some of the most succulent vegetation is along these riparian areas, along these waterways, where you're likely to, we assume we're going to find the most deer in those areas, which probably explains why the lions are using them. Next, we have chaparral, another dense shrubby habitat providing good cover. You can see strong selection by the mountain lions for chaparral. The one natural vegetation type that they really tend to avoid, at least most age and sex classes, except for subadult males, is open meadows. And so mountain lions across their geographic range are known to typically not select or even avoid open structure habitats like grasslands, meadows, and we certainly saw that in LA. Mountain lions we think they require dense cover for stalking their prey. Also, they probably use dense cover to get out of the way of humans, particularly in Southern California. And then finally, we have upland woodlands. We also see selection of this habitat, which provides cover, although probably not as good cover as you find in the dense chaparral or even riparian woodlands. And so the selection is a bit more modest there. Now let's take a look at the anthropogenic landscape features. This was certainly of interest to us. And we'll start with development, and development is what it sounds like. So this is basically residential or commercial development, buildings, houses, businesses, that kind of thing, a lot of human activity. And somewhat non-intuitively, these mountain lions are actually selecting development. But keep in mind, this is distance-based selection. So all this says is that the mountain lions are closer than we'd expect by chance within their home ranges to development. It doesn't necessarily mean they're in development. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other anthropogenic landscape feature we looked at, we call altered open. And so these are open structured areas that are modified by humans, though not to the degree that development is. This is things like golf courses, cemeteries, potentially agricultural areas, manicured parks within the city, that sort of thing. And you can see that mountain lions are pretty strongly avoiding this in all age and sex classes. And that again makes sense given that there really isn't any cover there. And also there's a fair bit of human activity. Now back to the development, again, it turns out that even though they're closer than we'd expect by chance, they actually rarely enter development. So here we can assign values in terms of looking at the telemetry locations and how close they were. And it turns out on average, we see the different age and sex classes in many cases are close to 2 kilometers on average away from development. And certainly in all age and sex classes over 1 kilometer. So even though they're selecting it, it's not like they're running the streets very often. They're still pretty far from development, but within their home ranges, they're closer than you'd expect by chance alone. Why is that? We're not exactly sure, but our hypothesis is that probably these are good areas to find deer. So again, it's a really dry landscape in Southern California. Development is a place where you're going to have artificial water sources, sprinklers, swimming pools, also succulent cultivated vegetation planted by humans that's probably used by deer. And furthermore, we know that deer like disturbed areas. And so all these things probably add up to it making sense for mountain lions to at least tend to be closer than you'd expect to development, while not generally actually entering development, because we also know that they typically avoid humans. Okay, so to drive that point home, and I don't know if this banner is kind of getting in everyone's way, I'm going to actually try to, sometimes it'll go away if you do that. But anyway, the actual use of development is what it says underneath there. And so development, basically what we did here, this is all animals. So we looked at both their telemetry locations and their home range and looked at the proportion that was made up of development. So basically what this says is that only 1% of the telemetry locations for the mountain lions fell within development, and only 3% of their home range overlapped with development. So again, they're selecting development in terms of being closer, but they're really not in development very often. I did put in P22 and P41 because again, they do things a bit differently given on where they live or given where they live. And so you can see P22, he was actually in development a little bit more than the population average at 6%, P41 even higher at 9%, but still over 90% of the time they're steering clear of development. And you can see that their home ranges encompass quite a bit more development than the population average. And again, that's all based on where they live, which are surrounded by these dense neighborhoods. So how do they deal with living in that more urbanized environment? We did look at time of day across our resource selection model. And for most of the animals, it didn't, it mattered a little bit, but really they sort of did the same things regardless of time of day. The two outliers, once again, were P22 and P41, who strongly changed their behavior across time of day, presumably to avoid human disturbance. Okay, so you can see for both these animals, during the day, they strongly avoided development, particularly P22. Then at dawn and dusk, so during crepuscular times, P22 continues to strongly avoid development, P41 actually flips to moderate selection, so he's closer to development during the evening and morning hours. And then at night, so actual nocturnal periods, we see P22 relaxing his avoidance that he shows during the day and dawn and dusk, and showing no pattern of selection or avoidance. And then P41 shows strong selection, so much closer to development at night relative to his avoidance during the day. Okay, so time of day matters for these animals living in the more urban environments, and presumably, again, this is their way of minimizing the risk of encounters with humans. So these pictures really hopefully drive that home a little bit. On the top are some locations for P22 in Griffith Park. On the bottom, P41 in the Verdugo Mountains. And basically the blue locations are night locations and the orange locations are daytime locations. I think P41 really shows it best. And given that we saw that he flips to selection both during evening and morning hours and also during the night, that really comes out well with this picture. You can see that his daytime locations in orange, typically pretty far up in the mountains, up in the hills. And then at night, his locations are really a lot closer to development. And in some cases, he actually gets down into the neighborhoods and he's moving through these high density development areas, which is pretty interesting, but always at night. So what's he doing down there? Well, who's to say really, except that there are surveillance cameras at a lot of houses in the Los Angeles areas. And occasionally we get pictures from folks. And P41 was seen carrying this domestic cat. And on the bottom, it's hard to see, but he had a raccoon there. So potentially, sometimes they may go in to these urban areas in looking for basically an easy meal. And some of these small prey items that are probably pretty easy for mountain lions are associated with humans, certainly house cats. And of course, raccoons, we tend to find a lot of raccoons where there's a lot of people and garbage and that sort of thing. Okay. So that's just kind of a bit about how they move around and navigate the LA landscape. I also wanted to quickly touch on some of our results in terms of looking at their survival and mortality with the radio color data and specifically what's killing them. And so this is for independent age animals, again, adults and subadults in the greater LA area. And what we found is that we estimated the mortality rate from human causes annually to be about 13%. So 13% of the animals are killed in some ways by humans every year, whereas natural mortality is a bit lower at about 5%. And so what were these specific causes? Well, in the LA area, the leading human causes were vehicles and being basically dying from rodenticide poisoning, which is certainly unfortunate. Also, occasionally we have animals that are poached. So hunting mountain lions is not legal in California. It's actually the only Western state that has banned mountain lion hunting, but occasionally they're killed illegally. And there are ways to kill mountain lions legally in retaliation, generally for livestock depredation. You can request a permit from CDFW. The regulations have actually changed a bit there, and I'll talk about that later on. But we've only had one collared animal that was killed on a depredation killing. It's actually much more common in other areas across the state. I'll come back to that later. The leading cause of natural death for mountain lions in our study area is intraspecific strife, which is a fancy way of saying mountain lions killing other mountain lions. And actually, even though we consider this to be natural, because this happens in virtually every mountain lion population, we actually think it may be somewhat exacerbated in our study area due to those space limitations that might tend to increase the frequency with which animals get into fights and die. Yeah, so that kind of concludes the first part of the talk, more or less setting the stage for hopefully some of the more interesting work that we did looking at the population dynamics and specifically the population viability of isolated mountain lion populations in greater LA. And I just want to introduce a few additional co-authors that were really instrumental to this work, including Peter Mahoney, Winston Vickers, Paul Byer, Walter Boyce, and Holly Ernest, along with Seth and Jeff. And I'm going to start by talking about the extinction vortex. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the extinction vortex. It's a pretty kind of aggressive term, and it's the theoretical basis for how we think small wildlife populations should operate. And so if a wildlife population is small and isolated, typically there's some deterministic stressor that's made it small, and that tends to be things like habitat loss, fragmentation, maybe overhunting. And these deterministic stressors interact with the structure of the population and the environmental condition to really determine age-specific survival and reproduction, which in turn obviously determine the growth rate or decline of a population and the population size. Now, in a small population, it's really important to recognize that the impact of random demographic events, so animals dying more frequently over a shorter period of time for random reasons, maybe animals get hit by cars or fall off a cliff, whatever it is, the impact of these random demographic events is greatly magnified in small populations. So you lose a few animals over a short period of time in a large population, not a big deal, blip on the radar. You lose that in a population of 15 animals like the Santa Monica's, a much bigger deal. Additionally, what's a big deal in small populations are genetics. And so we have higher rates of inbreeding in small populations and genetic drift. And these two factors serve to reduce genetic variation in individuals. When it gets to an extreme degree, we can see in populations what's called inbreeding depression. And this is when low genetic diversity and inbreeding actually starts to compromise survival and reproduction. And so when that happens, it feeds back obviously on survival and reproduction, reduces them, which further reduces the growth rate and the population size. And this part here is known as the extinction vortex. And once a population enters the extinction vortex, it can be hard to pull it back out, and the probability of local extinction is greatly increased. So probably the most well-known example of this for a large carnivore and a large felid would be with Florida panthers. And so the deterministic stressors with panthers was habitat loss and overhunting. They used to range throughout the southeastern United States, but by the 1960s and 70s, they were restricted to a small portion of southern Florida. And inbreeding depression had set in. So this isolated population had lost a lot of genetic diversity, and their survival and reproduction had been reduced as a result. And they seem to be very much on the brink of extinction in the 1980s. So in 1995, a really ambitious genetic restoration program was initiated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they released Texas pumas. So the closest population of mountain lions to Florida panthers was actually all the way in Texas. And so they brought animals from Texas, specifically females, adult females, released them into South Florida. They bred with the Florida males and brought new genes into the population. So almost immediately, we started to see a decrease in inbreeding traits in South Florida in panthers and a rapid numerical increase. So you can see throughout the 80s and mid 90s, you see the population hovering around 20 or 30 animals. Then the Texas pumas are released in 1995. Over the next 10 or so years, you see this rapid numerical increase from 20 or 30 to over 100. And actually today, it's thought that there's probably more than 200 panthers in South Florida, and they're actually expanding a bit geographically. So all good news. And really, we think that this genetic restoration program literally pulled them out of the extinction vortex and prevented almost a certain extinction of Florida panthers. So let's go back to California. And there's some really interesting parallels, maybe unfortunate, but certainly interesting. And so we've got two isolated mountain lion populations. I've talked a bit about the Santa Monica Mountains, which we've looked at before, about 15 animals in this population, maybe 6 to 8 breeding adults at any one time, really small population. Also a very similar situation in the Santa Ana Mountains, a bit larger, maybe on the order more like 25 or 30 animals in the Santa Anas, but a very small population. And both, again, are isolated by these massive freeways, a lot of urbanization, such that immigration and emigration in and out of the population is highly restricted and very rare. So with that in mind, we've documented the lowest genetic diversity in these two populations for any Western mountain lions. In fact, the lowest genetic diversity that's been seen for the species outside of Florida panthers, and we know how that went. So there's a lot of legitimate concern about the potential for local extinction and potential for inbreeding depression in these small isolated populations in Southern California. And so this low genetic diversity is certainly the result of inbreeding, and I want to try to make that point to you as clearly as I can. And so we've documented really high rates of inbreeding in both populations. So this data comes from the Santa Monicas. This is a pedigree analysis. What we've got in green are breeding females. Okay, they're being tracked with GPS collars, so we know who they are. and we track them to their dens. When they have kittens, we're able to document reproduction. We show males here in blue, and if a male and female are connected with these red lines, that means they're a mated pair. So because the males don't hang around and they're breeding multiple females and not spending time raising the kittens, we don't know who the males are, but we were able to work that out later with genetics. And so basically what you can see is we've got 3 breeding females here breeding with these males. And once we used genetics to figure out who it was, unfortunately, it wasn't males, it was male. It was the same male, P12, who basically did virtually all of the breeding in the Santa Monicas for a number of years. And so this is pretty intense. So we have P12 mates with P13 here, has P19 and a number of other kittens in multiple litters. Then P12 starts breeding with his daughter, P19, has P23 and a number of kittens from multiple litters. And then P12 starts breeding with P23, who's his daughter, his granddaughter, and also his mate. So that is some really intense inbreeding, and no mystery why they've lost genetic diversity so quickly, because they're mating with close relatives. So with that in mind, let's put a few, I'm sure most of you know these terms, but let's define a few terms just so we're all on the same page. When we're talking about inbreeding in small populations, let's start by just defining inbreeding. So that literally is, of course, the mating between close relatives. And so inbreeding reduces genetic diversity, particularly in small wildlife populations. But is that a bad thing? Well, certainly in human societies, it's frowned upon. In wildlife, it has some sort of different connotations. And honestly, in some situations, you can have inbreeding in a small population without any noticeable deleterious effects. When there are deleterious effects, this is when inbreeding depression, we say that inbreeding depression has occurred. So this would be a negative manifestation of inbreeding, where you actually start to see compromised survival and reproduction from the inbreeding due to low genetic diversity. Okay, so inbreeding is actually the mating between close relatives, which can happen, and at some point inbreeding depression might creep in and start to actually negatively influence survival and reproduction. And once inbreeding depression is set in, this is basically where we'd say that a population has entered the extinction vortex. And in some ways, it's probably only a matter of time before that population might go extinct. So what can we do about it? Once it was recognized that these populations had such low genetic diversity, at least for the Santa Monicas, folks started to get together and think about how can we construct a highway crossing over this massive 101 freeway that has, all these lanes of traffic. It's a huge, really busy freeway. But of course, when LA was sort of being constructed and when these freeways were put in, no one unfortunately was really thinking about wildlife connectivity. So it'd be quite expensive to do this, and that's really the major drawback. The idea would be to set it up, and this is at Liberty Canyon. You can see where that is here. We think this would be the best spot because there is natural habitat on both sides of the freeway. Additionally, a number of animals have been hit on the freeway right here, suggesting that they're trying to cross there. So if we could get this big vegetated highway crossing structure, potentially we could get new animals bringing new genes into the population. Pretty ambitious structure. Actually, you can see it's going to go over a second road as well. Be a real shame to have them come across the 101 and they get hit on the smaller road. So, if you're in for 50 million, why not go the full 80 and make sure that that animal survives? And so this was proposed, and folks have been raising money and working on it for a number of years. There's been some movement on it lately, as I'm sure you've heard, and we'll come back to that later in the talk. So what we did, and specifically what I did, my kind of entrance into this system and this research was in 2014. So I met up with Seth and Jeff, who had been working on this population for a while. And I started a postdoc working with Seth and others at UCLA to basically model the population viability and really to try to study. I really wanted to study these interactions between demography and genetics. And actually, after my master's, I'd worked with Florida Panthers for the state agency in Florida. And so, I've been kind of thinking about these problems with large cats for a number of years. And when I saw what was going on with Seth and Jeff's population, I was really excited to try to, dive in there and do some modeling and try to figure out what these interactions meant for viability. And so we constructed an individual-based population viability analysis. And I think it's a pretty cool model. So by individual base, you can imagine these sort of imaginary individual mountain lions running around in our modeling environment, and we simulate breeding events. And importantly, we have all this empirical genetic data as well as the empirical telemetry data about how they survive, how they reproduce, and their genetic profiles. And so we can set up the population really realistically like we think the population is in terms of the age, sex, and genetic structure. Okay, so all these animals have these profiles, these genetic profiles. And then when they breed in the model, we can assign new genetic profile to the kittens using the principles of Mendelian genetics. So we basically take one allele from the mother, one from the father, and we create a new mountain lion in the model. And then that kitten might grow up, it might survive, it might breed as it would based on the best data we have. And that's how we project the model forward to make predictions about what we're going to see in terms of demography, population size, and genetic structure going forward. So our model does what most PDAs do, and that allows us to estimate population growth over a specific time period, extinction probability over that time period. But what's really cool about it is it also, in a really realistic fashion, allows us to measure genetic diversity or predict genetic diversity in the future. And so we can sort of gauge how quickly their genetic diversity will continue to erode in this small population. Also, we can look at different scenarios with immigration. So like I said, we don't think there's very much immigration happening now, but we can simulate higher rates of immigration to ask questions about what might happen if we can get new animals coming in and bringing new genes. And the way we did this was with genetic data that we've gotten from mountain lions that we're tracking in the adjacent areas. And the question here, one of the questions was basically, how would the proposed highway crossing potentially benefit lions? And specifically, what would be the genetic and demographic impact of getting new lions to cross over into the Santa Monicas? Okay, so what did we find? First, let's ignore genetics. I told you that's one of the more interesting and important parts, but we're going to ignore it for the time being because demography, even before we get to genetics, is also an important part of the story. So the first thing we did with the model, this is mean extinction probability after a 50-year model projection. So we project the model forward 50 years to make projections and predictions about the likelihood of the population going extinct. And we did so under different immigration scenarios. So here is if there's no immigration, a completely closed population. This is a very low level, which we're calling observed immigration. Occasionally animals have come across the road. We've documented that with both telemetry and genetics, but it's very rare in both the Santa Anas and the Santa Monicas. And then we simulated higher immigration than we think occurs with one immigrant every 4 years, 2 years, or every single year. And then we saw what was the impact on extinction probability based on the best available data. And you can see with a closed population, let's start with the Santa Monicas in red. You can see we go from an almost 30% probability of extinction over the next 50 years to less than 3% if we get one immigrant every year. So basically, even before we worry about genetic diversity and the extinction vortex, the model predicts that connectivity is going to greatly improve the likelihood for this population remaining viable for the foreseeable future. And we see a very similar trend in the Santa Anas. So basically, every time we increase immigration in the model, probability of extinction comes down, even before we think about genetics. But let's think about genetics. And so here is another graph. This is where it gets really interesting and a little more pessimistic. So this is observed heterozygosity, our measure of genetic diversity on the y-axis. And then here's our 50-year model projection again on the x-axis. And again, the different immigration scenarios. So no immigration, low level of immigration, such as might be occurring now, one immigrant every 4 years, one every 2 years. Now, the red line, you're probably wondering what that is. And so what that is, that's the level of genetic diversity that was documented in Florida panthers, so another population of the same species, that when they had inbreeding depression, basically when they almost went extinct due to complications between genetics and demography. So that's really where we don't want to get to in California. And so then we can send our model forward 50 years and track the erosion, the predicted erosion of genetic diversity under different levels of immigration. And what you can see is with no immigration or very low immigration, the model is predicting a pretty precipitous drop-off in genetic diversity. For the Santa Monicas, it's predicting a 40 to almost 60% decline in genetic diversity in the next 50 years under the landscape conditions that are currently there. So that's catastrophic. And no one knows for sure when inbreeding depression would set in a small isolated population. But if you ask conservation geneticists, and it's published in the literature, they've made statements like, well, you should be concerned about inbreeding depression if you lose 5 to 10% of your genetic diversity over 100 years. So here the model is predicting in 50 years, you're going to lose half or more of your genetic diversity. Okay, so not good, and a pretty bleak prediction if nothing is done to improve landscape connectivity. So let's look at what happens if you do improve it. Much more optimistically emerging from the model are predictions that if you can get more immigration, let's say you can get one immigrant every 2 years, which we think is definitely realistic over a highway crossing structure, then you can see the population largely maintains its genetic diversity. Of course, there's a lot of variation, but in general, the mean genetic diversity of the population after 50 years stays above this sort of red line, which would be entering the extinction vortex. So the model basically gives us a pretty bleak outlook if nothing is done, but it suggests if we can improve connectivity, that we could potentially maintain genetic diversity for the foreseeable future. Okay, so we took it one step further, and I guess getting a little bleaker, back to the negative here. What happens if inbreeding depression occurs? So the last slide shows that if nothing is done, we should be very concerned about the potential for inbreeding depression in these small populations. And so what we did is we tweaked the model to simulate what would happen if inbreeding depression sets in. And we did that for both the Santa Anas and the Santa Monicas. And again, we benefited from all the information from the Florida Panthers. I actually was lucky enough to take part in those analyses where we compared survival of different age and sex classes for inbred Florida Panthers and then the outbred Florida Panthers after genetic restoration, when their genetic variability had been restored. And as you'd expect, the survival was lower for the inbred Panthers. And so we tweaked our input survival parameters for the California model to reflect that reduction in survival that was seen in Florida to mimic inbreeding depression in California. Reran the model for 50 years, and the model predicted 100% probability of extinction for both populations over the next 50 years. And actually, the median time to extinction was 12 years for the Santa Anas and 15 years for the Santa Monicas. So basically, the model predicts if inbreeding depression sets in and manifests this way in the same way that it did in Florida, that we should expect to see these populations go extinct, and it probably wouldn't last very long. And that's really not a huge surprise, given that again, for the Santa Monicas, we're talking about a population of 6 to 8 adults. If you reduce survival and reproduction, it's probably not going to go well. So what can we do about it? And more specifically, how should we manage small populations? Well, there's a couple of options. And first would be what was done in Florida. So you could translocate animals, bring animals with new genes into the population and try to restore genetic variability. And we made a couple of predictions, and we actually simulated translocation in our model. And the first prediction is that who you bring in terms of translocating animals should matter. And we predicted, given the polygynous mating system, that adult males would give you the biggest genetic impact because, again, males are mating with multiple females. It should allow them to spread those new genes around much more in a small population. And second, we predicted that it probably matters where you bring the animals from. And so we predicted if you can bring animals from a more genetically diverse population, source of animals, that should have a greater impact. So instead of bringing animals from right across the freeway, those animals across the freeway are more diverse than the animals in the isolated Santa Monicas and Santa Anas. But throughout the LA area, they tend to have lower genetic diversity than, say, mountain lions in sort of more wilderness areas or naturally functioning populations like in the Sierra Nevada mountains or areas like that. And so bringing animals from a more diverse source population was our prediction in terms of having a greater impact. The other way we could manage these populations is through highway crossing structures. And I've mentioned that before, quite expensive, but potentially quite effective. And so we've already modeled that, and I showed you those immigration scenarios are really mimicking what would happen with a highway crossing structure. But we made some comparisons with some additional model runs. And here what we're doing is we're assuming that in general, it's going to be subadult males that use the highway crossing structure. So in mountain lion populations, all subadult males disperse, whereas about half subadult females disperse. Importantly, though, subadult males tend to disperse farther and engage in riskier dispersal events. So we do think that they're more likely to use the highway crossing structure. And certainly any animal could come across it, but most likely it's going to be subadult males. So that's what we modeled in looking at the comparison between highway crossings and actually translocating animals. And so with this analysis that I'm about to show you, we were able to generate quantitative predictions about the genetic and demographic outcomes of specific management prescriptions. And we could really hand managers these quantitative predictions and say, if you're going to do translocation, here's how often you should do it. Here's how many you need to bring. Here's where you should bring them from. Here's who you should bring, et cetera. So it was pretty useful analysis. Haven't published it yet. That's on my list of things to do, but here's some of the preliminary results. And so again, another busy figure, but I'll walk you through it. And so this is our measure of genetic diversity again, expected heterozygosity. Okay, so here's where we start. This is the starting population genetic diversity. Here's where we get to after a 50-year model run if we do nothing. Again, that precipitous drop off in genetic diversity. And then all these other red and blue dots are basically simulating translocation of 7 animals in 50 years from various age and sex classes from both the local area right across the freeways and also in blue from the Sierra Nevada mountains. And you can see that both our predictions were pretty well supported, where the biggest genetic impact will be had by moving adult males from the Sierra Nevada mountains rather than bringing them right across the freeway. And actually, Holly Ernest, one of our co-authors, had a bunch of genetic data from the Sierras. And so that's how we were able to simulate this in our Southern California model. Next, we move to comparing translocation with immigration over a highway crossing structure. Similar plot. So again, expected heterozygosity after 50 years. Here's where we start. Here's where we get to if nothing is done. Okay, big drop off in genetic diversity. And now we're comparing 2 different potential conservation actions, translocation and immigration. For this model, we assumed that we'd be translocating adult males from the Sierras, given the results from the last figure. And we compared that to what would happen if we let animals come across the highway crossing structure at different frequencies. And so it's probably good to think about, well, what's our management goal here? Well, let's say our management goal is to maintain genetic diversity over the next 50 years. If we want to do that, the model says we can do it with translocations, and you should bring 1 adult male from the Sierras every 7 years. It also says you can do it with highway crossing structures, as long as you get 1 immigrant every 1 to 2 years. And so both look like viable options. And now we've got these predictions, again, that we can inform management action depending on which way managers end up wanting to go. They can, instead of sort of flying blind, they could know how many to bring, where to bring them from. And with the highway crossing structure, now we can, once it gets constructed, we can measure how many are actually coming in with trail cameras and other means, and make sure that we're getting an appropriate level. And importantly, we can test our model predictions as well, which is rarely done in conservation biology, actually. Okay, so what should we do? Highway crossing structures first. Really expensive, as you saw, but they're a sustainable long-term plan. So one of the nice things about it is it's probably the closest way to mimic natural dispersal for mountain lions. I think probably the most important benefit is that it's more than just for mountain lions. And so Seth and his team in the Santa Monica's, they don't just study mountain lions, they've actually documented strong genetic structure and low genetic diversity for coyotes, bobcats, songbirds, deer, amphibians in the Santa Monica Mountains. So those freeways are barriers not just for mountain lions. And if we use translocation, we're only helping 1 species. If we can get this big, elaborate vegetated structure, potentially we're hoping helping a whole number of species. Okay, but the model also suggests that translocation can be effective, particularly as a targeted tool. One thing to keep in mind, though, is this would be sort of signing up for a never-ending management strategy, which is not really what you want for effective management. You're hoping to build towards something where the population could take care of itself. And with the highway crossing structure, that's probably what you'd get. With translocation, the model shows very clearly it'll work, as you saw. So bring an animal, say, every 7 years, and you'll be okay in terms of maintaining genetic diversity and reducing that probability of extinction. But as soon as you stop, the population starts to lose that diversity again and kind of goes right back in the tank. However, it could be a really nice stopgap, particularly if crossing structures are delayed, or potentially maybe you're not getting the level of immigration that you expected. You could use translocation occasionally to give a genetic boost to a population that might be really on the brink of problematic extinction probability. So you could see, stepping back from Southern California, thinking about small isolated wildlife populations more broadly, where highway crossings and targeted translocations could be a really effective kind of two-tiered management strategy to really prevent extinction for some of these small isolated populations. Okay, so on to some good news. This is, again, another kind of look at what this highway crossing structure at Liberty Canyon over the 101 would look like. And a lot of you may have seen, but they broke ground on this structure on April 22nd, Earth Day 2022. So basically 3 weeks ago, big group of people went out there and they broke ground on this project. It's going to take about 2 years, and we should actually have, they've acquired all the funding that's needed. It's going forward. It's got all the right permissions. Governor Gavin Newsom and others were there for the groundbreaking. Pretty exciting event. And I think we're all excited about the conservation value for this bridge, but I'm really excited about the scientific value. Again, we can really test our model predictions, which is an exciting thing for a scientist and something that's rarely done. And more broadly, hopefully we can use this bridge to really kind of learn as much as we can about what happens when you restore connectivity for a small inbred wildlife population. Okay, so can we conserve large carnivores in Southern California and human-dominated landscapes in general? I would say yes, definitely. And I think the model that we've constructed and the research we've done supports that conclusion. And it makes it clear that restoring or maintaining landscape connectivity is really the key to viable populations in a human-dominated landscape. So there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about mountain lion conservation in Southern California. High rates of inbreeding, high rates of human-caused mortality, rodenticides, vehicle collisions, you name it, probability of extinction. But what I've been kind of thinking of it is, if we can do this in LA, and when I say do this, I mean conserve large carnivores. And here we've got the largest wild felid in the United States in its second largest city. If we can do it in LA, we can probably do it anywhere. And so we know that, conserving large carnivores pretty much everywhere is a huge conservation challenge. But if we can do it in Southern California, I think that bodes well that we can do it a lot of places. So almost at the end here, I just wanted to quickly point out that kind of jumping off from the Southern California work, my colleagues and I are now starting to look at a lot of these same questions and important questions across the entire state of California. This is a really cool figure that my PhD student, Kyle Doherty, put together. So his dissertation is looking at statewide mountain lion ecology with all this data that's been collected by a bunch of great collaborators across the state. And so this figure shows all the areas where my collaborators have tracked mountain lions, and the size of the lion indicates the amount of data that's there. And basically, we've got data from virtually everywhere that mountain lions exist in California. Very exciting opportunity. We're working closely with Justin Dellinger, who had a lot of the ideas for this project initially, formerly of CDFW. Now he works at UC Davis. And then we've managed to get pretty much everyone that works on mountain lions in the state on board. It's a great collaboration. And we started by looking at survival. And so here we've estimated survival rates with all the data from 1974 to 2020. Admittedly, most of the data is from the last 20 years and most of it is actually from the last 10 years. But nonetheless, this is over 500 animals tracked and almost 250 mortality events, showing us that female mountain lions survive about 80% annually in California, males a bit lower at 68%. And it's important, again, to think about what's killing them. And so pretty actually similar to what I showed you for Southern California in this, the greater LA area, where human-caused mortality is greater than natural mortality, about 13% annually, whereas natural mortality a little less than half of that at 6% annually. The leading cause of death are management killings. And so this would be largely killing of mountain lions in response to depredation of livestock. This is the leading cause of known death. We also had a number of unknown mortality events, as you often do in a telemetry study. And the second leading known cause of death are vehicle collisions across the state. And so again, human-caused mortality, even for a specially protected species, which mountain lions are in California, where you can't hunt them, human-caused mortality is the leading source of mortality. So hopefully our work in Southern California and beyond is a really good example of how science can be used to inform policy and conservation. And so clearly a lot of our work is sort of focused on thinking about the importance of connectivity and investigating the importance of it. And this is, in a lot of ways provided the scientific basis for this Liberty Canyon crossing project. And we hope that's only the beginning. Obviously, in California, we need more than just one highway crossing structure. And so we hope that this kind of, turns into sort of a popular thing to do, and we can start to restore a lot of that lost connectivity between populations. Human-caused mortality can be an issue for large carnivores in many places. In California, we saw that the leading cause of death is management killing, generally in response to depredation of livestock. So we're really interested in this human-lion conflict. Importantly, though, it used to be that anytime an animal, domestic animal, was killed, if you knew it was a mountain lion, it was documented to be a mountain lion, you could request a permit from CDFW to kill that mountain lion. If that permit was issued, then you could legally shoot the mountain lion. They've changed that to a 3 strikes policy, first for Santa Ana's and Santa Monica's, and now that's actually been extended to all throughout Southern California and the Central Coast. And the 3 strikes policy basically means that you have to try non-lethal means twice before actually getting a permit to kill the lion. So the idea there was to try to reduce mortality in these populations that we've seen have a higher probability of extinction than we would like. There's also been newer and stricter regulations and bans on certain rodenticides, these ultra toxic rodenticides. We saw that they can kill mountain lions in Southern California. So it's great to see that in 2020, they passed a law. I think it's the first state to do so, banning the use of a lot of these really toxic rodenticides. And perhaps the most sort of wide sweeping potential policy change for mountain lions is that right now there's a status review being done by CDFW where they're evaluating whether or not to list mountain lions in Southern California and the Central Coast population, where again, there's concerns about connectivity and viability as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. This was considered in response to a petition to the state of California. They took a look and said, yeah, this is something we need to think about. The Fish and Wildlife Commission overwhelmingly voted unanimously to conduct that status review. So that status review is ongoing. And again, the potential for a listing as threatened in Southern California and the Central Coast. And so our statewide research is sort of perfect timing, where we really hope to understand more about connectivity, model the population dynamics across the state, and understand viability more at a statewide scale, so we can inform that status review, and regardless of the status review, inform future conservation and management efforts for mountain lions in California. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to thank the many people and organizations that contributed to this work. Bunch of great collaborators, as I said, and I would be happy to take any questions. And if you don't get a question, but you have one, feel free to email me. That's my email at UNL. And that's me looking like a mountain lion in headlights when you've asked a tough question that I don't have a good answer for. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But yeah, thanks a lot for coming tonight. I probably went over time, but hopefully we have plenty of time for questions. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, John. I think this, first of all, it's a very satisfying story. So to show your work in the modeling and some of these initial steps happening, including these kind of, I guess, progress with policy as well. There are a lot of questions. A lot of them are actually asking about P22. I guess, you know, he is the celebrity, and and wondering how he got there in the first place.
Yeah, great question. And I typically actually mention that, but let's take a look at a map so we can visualize it rather than just me saying it. Actually, this is the perfect map to look at. So if my memory serves, P1 was the father of P22, and we never tracked P22. We didn't know P22 when he lived in the Santa Monicas, but his genetics data has taught us that he was actually an offspring of P1 and P2, who were the first males and females tracked in the Santa Monicas. Did a lot of breeding, including our analyses show that P22 was one of their offspring. So somehow, and we didn't have a collar on him at the time, he made it across these huge freeways. He must have crossed either the 101 or the 405, both of which is a really daunting task. And then again, crossed at least one more major freeway to get into Griffith Park. And he did that during the sort of classic age for dispersing. I believe when Jeff first caught him in Griffith Park, he was 2 years old. So as a subadult, excuse me, he somehow made it across this really, human altered landscape. And actually there's, maybe you've heard of it, some of you, there's a P22 day. I don't know if it's every year anymore, but they've had a P22 day, used to be every year, at least before COVID, where people would get together and kind of do a hike from the Santa Monica's over to Griffith Park. That was kind of, sort of a pilgrimage recreating his potential dispersal event. So yeah, that's what we think happened. And then once he got there, as is the case with most adults, they don't tend to disperse after that, and certainly not when you're surrounded by those huge freeways.
He must have been dumb when he was young, I guess.
Yep. Risk-taking behavior.
Exactly. Well, kind of just on the heels of P22 Day, someone's asking how tolerant are the various local government officials and residents in the greater LA area of mountain lions?
Yeah, another great question, and one that's definitely been on my mind quite a bit. So I think my sort of non-scientific impression is that people in general are fairly tolerant. And as far as, I guess, government officials, it's been pretty cool to see the way things have played out there. And I do think that P22's popularity plays into that quite a bit. But an event that maybe highlights some of that tolerance, both from people and also from city officials, was P22 was implicated, at least allegedly, in killing a koala at the zoo. It's not totally clear if it was him. There's also coyotes and mountain lions in that area. Granted, he was somewhat close to the zoo at that point. But regardless, when that sort of got out and was a big deal, obviously folks at the zoo weren't thrilled about it. But basically, there wasn't a big backlash where people didn't want P22 killed. People sort of looked at it as, this is a wild animal, and we need to sort of protect domestic animals from the wild native wildlife that we know are in the area. And so basically it was said, we're not gonna kill him, just gonna let him be. And so that was a pretty good sign. But I think it's certainly been on my mind, and again, my impression is that people are relatively tolerant. There's certainly a big sort of following of people that are fans of the mountain lions and P22 in particular, a lot of social media attractions and stuff like that. But I acknowledge that's not a really scientific way to look at tolerance and human dimensions and human perceptions. And so, I've talked with Seth, and we're hoping to maybe work with a colleague of mine here in Nebraska that does human dimensions and really look at that more scientifically. One of the things I think is really cool is this idea that typically, you might see, as you do in California, a lot of the political clout comes from urban areas where you have the most people, and yet the sort of human wildlife conflict is often not in those places, it's in rural areas. And so there's sort of this tension where folks in rural areas might quite rightly think, well, it's easy for you to be in a city and to be tolerant of mountain lions when you don't have to deal with them. But we can kind of test that idea here in Los Angeles, where you do actually have mountain lions in your backyard in an urban area. And so I think it would be cool to scientifically see if people put their money where their mouth is and are still supportive of wildlife when you've got this big predator in your backyard potentially. So long-winded way of saying, my impression is that people are pretty tolerant and supportive of the mountain lions. I'm sure that's not a universal feeling, and I certainly leave open the possibility that the people I interact with may not be an totally representative sample of all the perceptions out there in LA. So we'd like to look at it a little more scientifically.
That is very interesting, being able to really test that NIMBY, the NIMBY effect. And this is just a follow-up kind of about the tolerance, or not really tolerance, but just, I guess, people embracing these animals. Do you know, in terms of raising the money for that overpass, was it mostly local or organizations? And how much was it?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure the total amount, but we're talking about somewhere on the order of like 50 to 80 million. And I know that there are significant contributions from private foundations. The Annenberg Foundation made a huge jump. So they'd acquired quite a bit of money, and then the Annenberg Foundation, I believe, stepped up and put up a big grant that if it was matched, they would provide some many millions of dollars, and that was met. And so, yeah, I think some of the big donors are obviously wealthy private foundations, and then I'm sure there's a bunch of smaller contributions from a whole number of sources. But honestly, that's not anything I can take credit for. Seth and I and Jeff do the science and try to understand what the impact would be of more connectivity, that sort of stuff. But there's a lot of great people that did more of the kind of nitty gritty fundraising and sort of gaining support for the wildlife crossing to make it happen.
Good point. And there's a question here about the genetic health of these two populations, how it's already not ideal. Did you see any physical, hints or clues that it was really degrading?
Yeah. So there has been, when we first put the model together, at least in the Santa Monica's, we hadn't really seen anything, and there was no indication that the survival and reproduction was compromised in any way by genetics. Not to say that it couldn't have been starting then, but we certainly didn't have any evidence that it was. Since then, more recently, I think it was in 2020, and some of you may have seen this, Jeff actually caught a male with a kinked tail. And I meant to put a picture of that animal in here, and I slipped my mind. But let me jump to the Florida panther stuff. So this is a picture I actually took during a capture when I worked for the state of Florida, and there's a kinked tail on a Florida panther. Now this is a genetic defect that we don't think has anything to do with fitness. Having a kink in your tail probably doesn't impact your survival and reproduction, but it was linked to inbreeding in Florida panthers. And it's the really interesting thing, as soon as the Texas Pumas were released, any animal that had Texas genes, those kinks were really knocked out, and we no longer saw them. So when we were catching panthers, when I was working there, it was well after 1995. And so when we caught an animal, if we didn't see a kinked tail, we knew that animal had Texas genes. Once in a great while, we'd still catch one that did, and that was one of the kind of pure Florida panthers. So Jeff caught this animal in the Santa Monica's that had a kinked tail, and then a little while later, he on a trail camera, he got a picture of another one that was possibly a sibling of that one that he captured, but it was an uncollared animal that also had a kinked tail. And also there was some issues with the testes, which was similar to genetic defects we saw in Florida, where both of the testes hadn't descended. And so we're not exactly sure to what extent it's happening, but it does appear that some of these genetic issues that were linked to inbreeding in Florida panthers are starting to pop up in Southern California. And also Winston, who leads the research there in the Santa Anas, I believe also has a picture or two of captured animals or trail camera pictures of kinked tails in the Santa Anas. So hard to say exactly where they're at in terms of inbreeding depression, but the genetic diversity is low. It's not as low as it was in Florida yet, but we don't want to wait too long. So I think it does seem like there's some concerning signs out there today.
Interesting. This is a question about the extinction vortex. Are there any species right now, predators specifically, that are going through this similar sort of cycle?
Yeah, good question. So I'm sure there are. I'm trying to think of some good examples. So I guess another good example, which not being all that close to the research, I've got some colleagues that are much closer to it, but I don't know exactly what's going on now. But in wolves in Isle Royale, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. They basically, for years they studied predator-prey interactions on Isle Royale between moose and wolves. And then in more recent years, the wolves really dwindled down, and they were essentially showing signs of extinction vortex type issues where they had lost their genetic diversity. And the thinking was potentially, the way that new animals would come into Isle Royale is during cold winters, they'd come across the ice, but potentially related to climate change, or for whatever reason, they hadn't been having good lake ice quite as frequently, and fewer new wolves had come in, to the point where they were highly inbred, the wolves on Isle Royale, and they dwindled down essentially to functional extinction. But then a couple of years ago, new wolves, as you probably know, were reintroduced from various areas, including actually some wolves that we were studying up on a different island in Ontario. The wolves that we were tracking on that island, it's another long story for another day, but they had run out of prey on the island that we were studying them. And so the Ontario government decided to basically give their wolves to this reintroduction effort, and they were brought to Isle Royale. So I think it's kind of a success story and another really good opportunity for those scientists to study the impact of bringing new genes to a small isolated population. My guess is that they've, more or less emerged from the sort of dire extinction vortex situation with those new animals. Another good example where they're probably close, or at least there's the potential for extinction vortex dynamics, would be ocelots in South Texas. So maybe a lesser known example, a smaller cat, really beautiful cats down there in South Texas. A lot of people don't even know we have ocelots in the US, but they're only in a couple spots in South Texas, and they're highly isolated. Even from there's sort of two known populations in Texas, very small size, isolated from each other and from the other ocelots, say the closest ocelots in Mexico. And, they had very low genetic diversity. And yeah, I think they're sort of headed in a similar way as maybe Florida panthers and these animals in Southern California. So it basically tends to happen to large carnivores when they get in these small isolated situations. I think there'd be a similar situation probably with Iberian lynx over in Europe. Anytime you basically get cut off from other populations, it's kind of only a matter of time.
Interesting. This is my question. So ocelots, these lynx, mountain lions, and Isle Royale, do you think with wolves, sorry, I can't help it. Do you think due to their just kind of social structure or family values, that vortex might be a little bit slower?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, we're really interested in using this model to basically ask just that question and extend it to different systems. And I do think there'd be different dynamics with basically a monogamous mating structure and the social structure. I don't know. I could see it almost going the other way, where the polygynous mating system. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'd really just want to hold off and probably test it with the model. On the one hand, you could argue that the males could spread their genes around, and yeah, I could see where you're coming from, because the mountain lions are going to dominate breeding the way P12 did in the Santa Monicas. I guess it's going to depend on the size of the population, because in Isle Royale, it basically came down to there was like one male and one female left. And yeah, so it would be, I think the dynamics would be different. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave it as I'd love to quantify that with the model, but we haven't really adapted this beyond mountain lions to this point.
Well, I think everyone here can agree that we're really excited about just the progress that's been made with these lions populations. So kudos. And I do hope you get to test that model. Don't normally think about it that way, but that's a really good point.
Yeah, likewise. And yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, hopefully before too long, we have adapted this model not for these kind of extinction vortex questions, but more for the hybridization question with the eastern wolves up in Algonquin. That's turned out to be a kind of a beast. And one of the unfortunate things from a conservation perspective about Southern California mountain lions is there's so few of them, but it actually makes for a pretty easy system to model. When you got like 15 animals, it's kind of easy to understand the dynamics really well. And also the models just run a lot quicker. We're trying to do it for a much bigger population up in Ontario, and the computing time is a bit out of control, but Yeah, at some point, it's a PVA that would incorporate not inbreeding dynamics, but hybridization dynamics. And yeah, when we finish with that, hopefully I can come back and maybe do another webinar and show you what we learned there.
Perfect. Please do. And just thanks again for coming tonight, and for all the work you're doing. I can't tell you how many in the Q&A and also the chat, people are just saying what a great presentation. You're a really good teacher, I have to say. So thank you for that. And yeah,
that's not what my students said in the evaluations last semester, but I appreciate that.
Well, I disagree. I think some other people do too. Well, again, thank you for joining us, and for everyone who came to learn about these mountain lions, thank you. And we really appreciate you being here. And if you want to learn more about John's work, is there anywhere they could go, or just the University of Nebraska?
Yeah, I mean, you can check me out on the web at it's pretty easy. It's bensonlab.org. I've got a lab website which shows a bit about some of the research we're doing and my grad students and postdocs and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's probably the easiest place to find me.
So bensonlab.org.
Yep.
And for anyone else, if you would like to learn about the Wolf Conservation Center, you can visit us at nywolf.org. And also, just heads up, we do have some Mexican wolf puppies that are pretty much viewable 24/7 right now because they have not left their den yet, where we have a webcam. So we're very noisy, but you might get addicted, so just a warning. But you can find those on our website, again, at nywolf.org. So John, thank you. Thank you, everyone else. And we hope you see you again soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Yep, it was a lot of fun. And yeah, I appreciate the big turnout and all the great questions.
Thanks, guys. Night.